Hello there. As many of you will remember, I recently did a viewer survey where I asked what my subscribers would like me to talk about, what questions they would like me to answer. And one of the questions that I got asked a lot was, how did you wake up your wife? How did you get her to see that she was in a cult? And when I got this kind of coming up in the results, I went to show my wife and she said, "You didn't wake me up." And she's a little bit dubious about me making this video because she still has trouble recognizing that I woke her up. But what I said was, well, if I didn't wake you up, then are you saying that if I hadn't stopped being a witness, then you would have stopped being a witness all by yourself? To which there was this silence and kind of recognition. But I think in a way she's right, because in order to wake up from being in a cult, it really involves, you can't just have someone do it for you. You need to be willing to look at both sides of the argument. You need to be willing to look at evidence. And to my wife's credit, that's something she's always been able to do. And that's why, first off, I need to say on this subject that not everybody who has wives or husbands who are still witnesses and who, say for example, you've woken up and your wife or husband hasn't woken up yet, it's not, you shouldn't take for granted that they're going to wake up too. And I hear all sorts of horror stories of where someone's woken up but their wife or husband is still a witness and really opposes the person's efforts to emancipate themselves from the organisation. Great example is Eric over on the JW Struggle channel. He'll tell you all about what that's like. So it's not something you can take for granted. So I understand in a way my wife saying, "Oh well, you know, you didn't wake me up," but really I did. And I'm going to explain a little bit about how I did that. To tell the story, I really need to go back to 2011, to around May, when I first started to really wake up. I reckon it was as far back as November 2010 when I kind of consciously decided that really I no longer believed it. And it was way back then that I actually told my dad, listen, I don't believe this is God's organisation. But it took me until May 2011 to kind of really put my foot down. And this happened after, as I recall, one Sunday I decided not to go to the meeting. I think I was ill, and that was probably the excuse, but I didn't want to go anyway, is the truth. And while my wife and her parents were at the meeting, I sat down and I wrote a list, which I still have. I call it my 9 grievances. It's a very faded piece of paper because you probably can't see the writing because it's in kind of like a very light felt tip pen. But I wrote these 9 grievances, and it was when I wrote these and sat down and looked at how many issues I had with the organisation that I just thought, this is ridiculous. I can't carry on with this nonsense any longer. And just to give you, I won't read all of them, but just to give you a few examples, I wrote down, it's wrong to claim increase in numbers as evidence of Holy Spirit. What about millions who follow Catholicism, Islam? And obviously my point was that although the organisation tends to boast about its numbers, its whatever slim increase it has is a reason for it to boast of having God's blessing. You can't really use numbers as a reason to boast when other religions have so many more people joining them. So that was an argument I had. Another was on prophecy, and without going into it in too much detail, it was an argument I had with the Daniel book ever since I first read it when I was 20. And it was the fact that 2 prophecies in the Daniel book contradict each other. In one prophecy, in one explanation, of the King of the North, King of the South, Rome ends up becoming Nazi Germany. Whereas in another prophecy in the same book, and there's been a slight change to this, but it's essentially the same. If you remember the prophecy of the immense image, with the head of and the shoulders and the legs of various different metals, Rome ends up becoming Anglo-America. So my argument was, how can Rome become Anglo-America in one prophecy, but in another prophecy Rome becomes Anglo-America's arch rivals Nazi Germany? That just didn't make any sense. Why would God have two completely conflicting prophecies in the same book of the Bible? There was other ones as well. I didn't agree with higher education, or the stance on higher education. I thought it was hypocritical of the organisation to quote from scholars and professors when it wanted some support of its ideas, but to dissuade witnesses from becoming scholars and professors. I found that quite hypocritical. Other things too, the light getting brighter. I've already done a video on this. I didn't agree how it's used to explain errors, regressions by the faithful slave. If the faithful slave have Holy Spirit deep in the last days, nothing they say will be wrong or unscriptural. If there are errors, which there are, this means the faithful slave is given temporary false information by the Holy Spirit, which would never happen, and implying it could be grieving the Holy Spirit. So simple kind of logic being applied really to the teachings of the organisation I was now feeling compelled to be a part of, rather than genuinely wanting to be a part of. And I wrote all these down, and as I say, when I saw them all on the sheet of paper in front of me, it was just obvious I was no longer a witness, or I was a witness in name only. And my wife came home and I showed her the list, and she looked at it and she couldn't find any reason to disagree with any of the points that I'd made, which was quite surprising. I thought that there would be something she would say, well, you're being unreasonable here, but she agreed basically with all of it. I hope you don't mind if I just have Bessie on my lap for a bit, because my wife's left me with her and she's getting a bit anxious not having me give her attention, so I'll just give her a bit of attention while I'm talking. So anyway, the list of grievances, I wrote that, and not long after writing it I started to feel quite depressed, quite low about my situation, being in a religion I didn't want to be a part of any longer, and it felt as though I was living someone else's life. I wasn't really sure about anything really. Everything in my life was connected with the witnesses. I wasn't even sure whether my marriage was going to last, because that had all come about as a result of the witnesses. So I was starting to question pretty much everything about my life, and it got to the stage where I decided to write a letter to my wife. And it sounds strange, writing a letter, but I just find when there's really serious things that need to be discussed, I'm better at kind of expressing myself in writing, and where I can sit down and think about exactly how I want to put what it is I'm saying. And so I wrote a letter to my wife, and it went something along the lines of, I'm going to meetings for a religion I no longer believe in. I'm trudging around on the ministry, pretending to support an organisation I no longer support. This is all complete nonsense, and I can't do it any longer. And my wife read the letter and was very supportive, really. And she basically decided that even though she wanted to still be a part of the religion, she could understand why I had issues with it. It wasn't just me acting up or kicking up a storm over nothing, or being proud. There were genuine reasons why I could no longer be a witness. So what we agreed was that I would become inactive, but she would continue going to the meetings, and that she still believed it. So, without wanting to repeat too much of what I've already written about in my story, I'll put a link in the description. Then it became a case of me no longer having a reason to hold back from researching what my beliefs were. So I was going on JW Facts, I was reading Crisis of Conscience, and I was doing all of this with the perspective that I shouldn't take for granted that my wife would wake up too. My approach was, well, if she wakes up, she wakes up. If she doesn't, she doesn't. Nothing will be helped either way by me forcing the issue, basically. So if I found something that was earth-shattering, so if I was on JW Facts, for example, and when I found the information about the UN scandal and the fact that Watchtower had been a member of the United Nations as an NGO, it really had an impact on me. So I would say to my wife, you've got to look at this. But whenever I did that, I made sure that I had evidence to show her. So then she knew that if I had something to talk to her about, there was always going to be evidence to back it up. So that was important. But apart from that, I didn't push anything on her. If there was something really, jaw-dropping, then yes, I would say, oh, did you know about this? And I would show her. But apart from that, I kind of left her to come to me with questions, which inevitably she did at times. And this, in a way, highlighted another thing I wanted to say, which is that you can't take for granted that witnesses even know fully what their beliefs are. I'll give you an example. My wife is Croatian. I now live in Croatia. And in Croatia, they don't have the same access to Watchtower publications that we have in England or in America. Why do I say that? Well, they simply don't have all of the magazines going back into the 70s, 60s, 50s. On the Watchtower Library for English-speaking countries, the magazines on the Watchtower go back as far as the 1950s, and for the Awakes, they go as far back as, I think they've changed this, they go as far back as, I think it's the 70s. You get the 70s Awakes. You used to be able to get the 60s Awakes, but now it's just the 70s onwards, I think. I could be wrong. So basically what I'm saying is you can research your beliefs. Even in other areas, like, for example, you have the Insight book for English-speaking countries. You have the Jehovah's Witnesses Proclaimers of God's Kingdom book in English. You don't have that in every country, and you don't have it in Croatia. So fairly basic things about Watchtower's history are not known in countries like mine. So a lot of the information I was giving my wife were things that she should have known already, but she didn't know because she was basically in like a blackout. She had no way of knowing, for example, that Charles Russell believed that the Great Pyramid of Giza was God's stone witness, that every inch inside it correlated or was supposed to correlate with years in Bible prophecy, and that God had actually engineered and arranged for the pyramid to be built so that these measurements could inform his people. She had no way of knowing about that. She had no way of knowing about Beth Sarim. Fairly basic things about Watchtower history she just was completely in the dark about. So there was a lot of, for many months there was this kind of exchange of information, but it was driven by her. It was her wanting to know what her beliefs were supposed to be, basically. And then probably about a year after I properly woke up, I would say around May 2012, around that time, she by that time she'd pretty much woken up herself. But even then, people forget that waking up is a very gradual process, and just waking up in itself in a way doesn't mean you've completely woken up, because you can still be extremely sensitive about certain things that, you know, could still upset you. For example, criticizing the governing body or making fun of them. Even if you've woken up and you know that they're just a bunch of men, you can still be sensitive about that. And in a way, it's helped me having her at this kind of stage where she's behind me, because I've been able to use her as a sounding board when I'm writing my articles or doing my videos. I've been able to, especially if it's a sensitive subject, I've been able to say, you know, do you mind just reading this? How would that come across to, you know, a fully indoctrinated witness? Because I'm still quite sensitive myself, but she's even more sensitive because she's a little bit behind me, if that makes sense. So that is basically how I woke my wife up, and I would repeat that it's not something to be taken for granted, waking up any family member, whether it's your husband, your wife, your parents. I've had my experiences with other family members, shall we say, have been far less positive. And I think a lot has to do with the fact that when you're married to someone, you are with them all the time. There is more of a reason there is more of a motivation on the part of both of you to reach some kind of resolution to, you know, the differences in beliefs. Because, you know, especially if there are children involved, which there weren't in our situation, but you need to kind of you're both aware of the fact that you need to reach a decision. Are we staying together, or are we splitting up, or are we staying together and both believing different things? So there's a little bit more motivation when it's a married couple. And in our instance, I was very, very fortunate to be married to a woman who is an independent thinker, who isn't afraid to examine her beliefs objectively and see both sides of the argument, and to ask questions. And I was very fortunate and feel very fortunate to have that kind of wife, really, because it could have ended up very differently. So I hope I've answered that question, and thank you for watching.